Good afternoon. I'm not sure where to look, as I'm sure everyone said, so I'm kind of probably going to walk around in circles, but maybe that itself is a metaphor for something. So I'm going to talk to you today about new metaphors. And what new metaphors are, well, I guess we'll come to that, because they're not necessarily new. They're things that maybe are very obvious, but actually they, we can look at them in a new light, and they can help us think in different ways. So, we're going to be talking about metaphors in lots of different ways today. And metaphors have different meanings. They have different associations and interpretations. But what they really are is they're a form of carrying across. So the word means, coming from Greek words meaning to carry across something. So a metaphor is, maybe a metaphor might be a bridge. Like a bridge might be a metaphor for a metaphor, in a way. It carries us across, perhaps. Or maybe it's a ferry, for example, a boat, which is, carrying us across from one place to another, or from one way of thinking to another. Or maybe it's one of these things, some sort of moving walkway. And obviously, the thing with all of those is that they're, those are metaphors for metaphors, if you like. But what it really is, a metaphor, you can think of it as a designed thing, right? It's something that has been deliberately created by people to try to enable other people to see something or understand something in a different way. So a metaphor can be thought of as a device for seeing something in terms of something else. And there's this lovely phrase here from Kenneth Burke, who was a linguistics expert, that a metaphor brings out the thisness of that, or the thatness of a this, which I don't know how you're going to translate that, but I'm sure it translates in some way that makes sense. But maybe then a metaphor, could be something like a headset, or a VR headset could be a metaphor for in the sense of it's a device for seeing something in a different way. I think the thing is to be aware of, and we'll look at this in more detail in a minute, but throughout all of this talk, the idea is that a metaphor is not the thing itself. So bear that in mind, that none of these things we're going to talk about are actually the thing we're talking about. They're metaphors for something else. So they're a map, but not the territory. They're a kind of model for, I'm glad that fade works, nice. All of these things are maps rather than the territory itself. So all of them are models, right? They're just models, and all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I'm sure you've heard, or some of you have heard that before. That's from George Box, who was a statistics, it's from a statistics textbook. But I think we can think about it maybe in terms of that, actually all metaphors are wrong, but some are useful sometimes. And that sounds very weak. I guess that sounds like, well, is that even worth talking about? But hopefully I'll show you that it is an interesting subject. So here's the thing, right? You can use this as a trick for being annoying at parties and upsetting people if you want, or just being annoying in general, which is whenever people are talking about things, anything they mention, you can always throw it in the conversation and say, well, that's a metaphor for something. They're talking about, I don't know, the weather has changed, or, they got rained on the way home or something, or, their clothes were not appropriate for an event. And you go, well, that's a metaphor for something. And there are ways in which that, as a sort of annoying party game, can actually be quite a profound way of generating new ideas in a design sense. Almost the idea of taking anything that happens in someone's life and saying, well, I wonder what that's a metaphor for. I don't know, like me walking around in circles like this. If you said, well, that's a metaphor for something in your life, isn't it? Like that, it's annoying and it upsets people, but it's also quite a good way of generating ideas. You go, well, maybe it is. Maybe there is something there. So anyway, we'll come back to this in a minute and about why some of these things are interesting, but I just thought it was worth having some of that as an introduction. So I work at Carnegie Mellon School of Design, which is in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania in the US. And Pittsburgh it was an industrial city. It was a big steel-making town, and it was in the 1950s, one journalist described it as hell with the lid taken off, which is an interesting metaphor, right, for a city. It's not really like that now, so it's kind of evolved to be what they call EDS and MEDS, which is kind of education and medical research, but also lots of hipsters and robots as well. There's a lot of robots being developed in Pittsburgh and driverless cars and so on, and there's lots of bridges. And I mean, it just gives you a sense of the sort of place where we're working. But Carnegie Mellon, I mean, we're most, I guess, in the design field, one of the big things that we do is we've developed this sort of model of design education called transition design, which is about trying to prepare designers now to think in terms of much longer timescales and to see their work in a much bigger context than just immediate problem solving. So transition design is a sort of, I mean, a transition is a metaphor, I suppose. It's a sort of an approach to trying to bring that into design education, just longer timescales, more connection to ecosystems, more kind of breadth of what's included in design, so that it's not just about solving problems now, but it's also about considering how those problems change over time, or maybe there are problems that can't be solved. But you know, the aim of design would then be to kind of work with them rather than to try to solve them. We also, another thing we do, which I'm involved with, is we have this way of teaching design they're called design for environments, which is everything from kind of physical environments, so a bit more like architectural stuff, to digital, these kind of idea of like hybrid environments, which we're really in now. You know, we're in a physical room that has so much technology in it that determines in some way how we interact with it. Like if this room didn't have so many screens and microphones and all of that, it would be very different. So it's a hybrid environment, right? The design of this space and this experience is not just physical, it's not just digital, it requires everything to work together. So we try and teach students that. I don't know how successful it is, but it's an approach that is evolving. It's a new kind of way of thinking about design, I think. So I run something called the Imaginaries Lab, which is a new research group, really, where we, with a group of students and me and a dog, and we try and do sort of work that, well, I'll explain what we do. So this is a bit kind of convoluted or a bit long-winded, but we try and use design methods to understand how people understand. So it's taking the methods that designers might use and using them to do research with people to explore how do people understand things. Also, can we help people understand in new ways? So understanding how people understand, but also helping people understand in new ways or different ways. And then also helping people imagine new ways of living or new ways they could do things. So once you've got people understanding things in a different way, maybe they can imagine different ways of living or how their lives could be different. So there's a kind of futuring aspect to the work as well. And ultimately, the goal really is to try to enable people to change the behavior of the systems they're in, so that it's about agency, or it's about tools for giving people agency to change the systems they're in. Now that sounds very impressive and impractical perhaps, but that's the aim, right? This is the mission statement rather than the actual thing. But the sorts of projects we do, we've done work. For example, this project was around how people understand local government. It's often very complicated to people. It's a sort of impenetrable fog of organizations. You don't know who's in charge of things at a city level and this sort of stuff. So we've tried to apply design tools, the sorts of things you might use in service design or in kind of user experience design, getting people to map their understanding of the system, telling stories, creating instructions for other people even, like how would you explain this system to other people? We've done, some of these things are a bit more speculative, like this is a project where people could text or even call a fire hydrant to tell it their ideas for the future of the city, not because the fire hydrant was actually listening. It was just a service that was running that had basically an SMS service. But the idea was that it's a focal point that people could actually they could talk to. It's there. It sees you in a way. We've been doing projects around, and I'll come back to this in a minute, around different types of interface. Like if you could hear electricity, for example, would you understand it differently, rather than just seeing kind of numbers on a screen or on a sort of electricity bill? There's also things like, this is something, and I'll come back to it in a minute, but could you use model landscapes to explore how you think about your own life? Could you construct a kind of model of your life as a landscape? And how does the process of doing that and talking to other people about it, how does that affect how you think or how you understand and what you could do differently? And also things around like mental health, for example. Like could a similar method be used to help people share their own experiences through kind of materializing how they feel as a research tool in a way? So you could use it. I mean, you could use it for therapy. We didn't because we're not licensed to do that. But you could use it in that way. we also do quite a lot of work about trying to create interfaces that emphasize qualities rather than quantities. And again, I'll talk more about this in a minute, but there's this idea that maybe there are some things where actually the qualities, rather than just quantifying things, actually interfaces could help us understand better the qualities of phenomena in the world or things we're trying to understand. Okay, but one question you might have is, well, what does imaginaries mean? Because it's not quite the same as just imagining things. And it's actually a term from sociology that really refers to kind of like society-level understandings, or, you know, as a society, what is people's imaginary of Brazil? What's people's imaginary of, or imaginaries of Rio de Janeiro? Everyone has a slightly different interpretation of what they visualize or what they imagine, but they kind of intersect and overlap, and that overlap is what makes up a kind of cultural understanding of a concept. So imaginaries in sociology are really not that different to what we might think of in design as sort of mental models, but at a much bigger scale, and they've got cultural factors associated with them and so on. I think probably what we're doing is not quite what the sociologists would call imaginaries, but it was a good word, and the domain name was available, so, you know, that's how things get named. But this is one of the key concepts behind it. This is from a 1920s psychology book, in fact. But the idea that if people define situations as real, they're real in their consequences. Like, if you imagine something to be true and you believe it to be true, you act in accordance with your belief. And that kind of, this may seem really obvious. You might be thinking, well, yeah, that's how everyone does things. But design has quite a lot of we could do with this. You know, designers are able to help people explain how they think about things, and help people visualize things, and help people kind of think through what they believe to be real. And I think that angle is something that we're trying to bring to this kind of area. So really what we do is we look at things like metaphors, mental models, mental imagery, like how do people actually visualize things, the heuristics, or the sort of rules that people follow for themselves, whether or not they've actually expressed them formally, like people have rules that they follow. Things like folk theories and the sort of the simple cause and effect links that people make between things in their lives, and the stories people tell. And, you know, so people often act on imaginaries. I mean, that's the basic kind of presumption, is that people often act on their understanding of situations. They act on their model of what's going on. And actually, like, people's misunderstandings can be a really interesting place to start exploring these imaginaries. Like, how do people understand something? How do they misunderstand it? And particularly with technology, I mean, I think many of these things, so I'm going to show you some things which I'm not sure whether they're all real, but they're quite funny, so that's worth it. So things like this, and you've probably seen some of these before, but like, this is someone asking Facebook directly to do something. And like, it's funny now. It's funny now, but actually in a few years' time, this might be perfectly normal, you know. And it's almost this understanding, like, why would it not work like that? Other things, you know, people are talking to, you know, Amazon Echoes and so on. Why would I not be able to talk to Facebook in that way? You know, this is how early computer programmers, I think, in many ways wanted people to be able to interact with systems. You know, this one again, I mean, quite a lot of these are about people's sort of misunderstandings of how to do something. But like, and it's funny, but also it's, you know, as a research tool, it's really interesting. Someone wants to do this. They're trying to achieve this task, right? They're trying to do this. It's not like they're just being silly. They're trying to do something. And their understanding of the interface is that, well, I ought to be able to do it in that way. This one's quite funny, sad, I don't know. It's a bit more complicated to understand maybe, but basically someone in this kind of online gaming platform realizes after a year that their microphone isn't plugged in. And so the fact that no one's ever replied to anything they've said, they hadn't noticed. And they didn't even realize they were there. So, I mean, it's perhaps it's a slightly different level of thing. This one's quite, I mean, I just put this in because it's funny, but this is someone's who misunderstands what a cereal bar is. So like a, you know, kind of bar of, like a granola bar, something. You know, why doesn't it dissolve and turn into a bowl of cereal? Isn't that what it's for? So anyway, I don't know whether this is real, but I quite like it. There's a few of these. I should probably, yeah, maybe these take up too much time, but I don't know. This is one about someone using Netflix in a particular way, like always having a model of that they're broadcasting stuff, I need to record it if it's on a particular time. But, interesting, that's the model that worked for a long time. That was the model for how you would record media or you consume media, would be that you found a particular time when something was broadcast and you recorded it. This is someone, again, talking to Applebee's, it's like a kind of chain of restaurants, fast food restaurants in America, kind of. And it... I suppose the thing there is that, actually, they could know her location. They could probably know which one she was talking about, actually. There's that potential is there for that system, actually, to be able to identify it, but it just doesn't exist at present. Some of these are just, I'm not sure these are real, but people's understanding of what is actually going on at the time. And then there's this one as well. Anyway, so the point is, people often act on their model of a situation, right? And designers, you probably know this, right? And this is everything from, how do people understand heating controls and thermostats? This is one of the most famous kind of papers in human factors, really looking at how different people understand, a thermostat on the wall, like a kind of rotary dial thing. Some people think of it more like a tap or a faucet that lets out more heat the more you turn it. When it's not actually, it doesn't actually work like that. It's more like a switch that just switches the heating on and off at a particular temperature. But in many ways, it works like a tap, in the sense that you want the room to be warmer, you turn it more and more, and the room gets warmer. So it kind of works, but even though it's not how the system actually works. But the designers of something like Nest looked at a lot of this research and saw that, well, even giving people like a countdown for how long it will take before it gets to a temperature, that sort of builds on the mental model the mental models that people have, and tries and uses it as part of the design process rather than just ignoring it. Because there's this idea, so this is from Lou Down, who's head of design at the UK government's digital service. When we don't know how a thing works, we make it up, right? And that, that's not necessarily always true, but it's true enough times that it's worth thinking of it as a kind of heuristic. And also that we only trust something if we think we know how it works. So people will make up stories about how things work in order to be able to trust it, because you've got to have some kind of explanation. And so if you think about how do these ideas apply to some of these big issues in technology, so AI and automation and algorithmic decision making and people's personal data and privacy and all of these things, like people's understandings of them or people's imaginaries of these concepts affect the sorts of projects that are done. They affect the kinds of work that's done and the sorts of things that get funded. Because these imaginaries come from somewhere. They often come from science fiction or they come from Hollywood, but they become kind of embedded in society, and we end up with robots that look like robots in movies rather than the other way around. But we might also think about imaginaries of bigger social issues and bigger challenges for humanity. Everything from, what are people's imaginaries of climate change, and how do those different imaginaries affect the policy decisions that are made, or how governments interpret these things. And loads of issues, public health and resources, and we'll come to some other things in a minute around stuff like the economy. We'll look at that in a minute. So basically, these kinds of things, I think, are worth. They're all things that designers are actually quite well placed to investigate, and they're important for design. So I suppose I'm trying to, persuade you that it's worth considering these in a sort of slightly more strategic way, maybe. So how did I come to this? Because I'm not a linguistic expert or anything in terms of metaphors. I was a product designer. I worked on things like folding bikes and injection molded plastic things that are all in landfill now. Sadly, but I became interested in the people dimension of this. Like the products that I worked on often were not very, the user experience was not always very good. And partly because we didn't do much research with people. We didn't kind of, it was more about the technology than the people. So I became interested in that. And eventually through various diversions, I ended up working on design for behavior change, which is, is also, terms like behavioral design or kind of persuasive technology, these sort of related areas around how you can design things that get people to do things in a particular way, or try and build on how people do things at present and change what they do. And a lot of it's applied to sustainability and environmental things. And the sorts of examples, in everyday life, like, kind of things like fitness trackers, that's a type of design for behavior change. Things that try to persuade you to slow down, or this is one from the Netherlands that gives you like a sad face if you're speeding, for example. Things like giving people feedback on how much energy they're using and in this case, what the carbon footprint is of what they're doing. Even things like, this is something in Pittsburgh where if you drive below a certain speed, you get green lights, a wave of green traffic lights, whereas if you go above the speed, you get red lights. So the aim is to try to change drivers' behavior over time. But even things like this is designed for behavior change, sticking bits of broken glass in the wall to stop people climbing it. That's a form of design for behavior change. It's not necessarily very nice. But you can take this sort of approach that everything that's designed, every piece of technology has some kind of hypothesis about human behavior in it. There's some kind of encoding or embedding, that there's like a theory that people behave in this way or they'll act in this way. And different people have said this in different ways, or similar things, like the idea that we design our world while our world acts back on us and designs us. That's from Anne-Marie Willis. It's an interesting idea that, in fact, in many ways, the way we do things is affected by the design of the world around us, but the design of the world around us is affected by how we do things. So there's this kind of circularity that's often present in these things. So assumptions about people's behavior get embedded in the world, and then they become true because we act in accordance with the assumptions that are built into the things we use. So I became interested in this, and I went and sort of studied this for a few years. I went. So this is Brunel University in London, which you might recognize from A Clockwork Orange, if you've ever seen the Stanley Kubrick film. It's in that movie, it's a dystopian re-education center, which it is in reality too. No, it's not. It's a very good place, but it's it's got a long history of behavior change, I guess, as a building certainly. So I tried to bring together lots of these different subjects and try to apply them to design. What will people? How does people's behavior? How is it treated in different disciplines? And how can you bring that together? So it was looking at things in different areas of psychology and different areas of research and try to make it relevant to designers. And so this through lots of workshops with lots of designers from different backgrounds, and some of them in industry, some of them students. Lots of different settings. Actually, that one's at Interaction 12, I think, that workshop. But it led to, and some of you might have seen this before, it led to this Design with Intent toolkit, which is like a kind of collection of patterns for behavior change, if you like. And a lot of them are quite unethical. Like, it's a collection that has lots of things in it that are actually they're not necessarily saying they're good things. A lot of them are there for completeness. But so this is a kind of toolkit that, like lots of things, is a card deck, and it's been translated by different people. So there is a Brazilian Portuguese version that Luis Oliveira translated that can be downloaded. But what I ended up doing was applying lots of this. Lots of this ended up being applied to energy use and sustainability. And so through various projects, this one was with a British government department where we looked at how people who are actually supposedly knowledgeable about energy and the environment actually, how did they behave? How did their actions relate to that kind of understanding? We did things like, designing various intranet apps and so on to help people log what they were doing so we could understand better what was going on. And a lot of it was just about making data visible. And then I went and moved to work at the Royal College of Art in London, where everyone drives Aston Martins as well, by the way. That's and so there I worked at the Helen Hamlin Centre, where and my boss was actually Rama Gewaro, who's talking tomorrow at 6 p.m. So on inclusive design, which is what the centre kind of works on and specialises on. So it's definitely worth watching Rama talk about this the centre tomorrow and some of the work that he's done and other people have done. But I worked there on one of the projects was this European collaboration of different organisations around living labs, which is this idea of buildings that are kind of set up or designed to be places for doing experiments. So this is actually a student housing block in Sweden, in Gothenburg in Sweden, that was designed from the start as a place to do experiments. So people would live in different ways, they'd have different technology present. They had like a new laundry, for example, that we worked on parts of the design for it where it would be shared together to see, does that affect how people do laundry? Does it affect how they talk to each other and so on? But also, does it affect the energy use? So the idea was, to be monitoring energy use and trying to understand it. And like lots of academic projects, it led to, books that are very expensive that no one reads, but they exist. But one of the big parts of the project was visiting people at home in their homes at present and trying to understand, how do they understand energy? You're told, use less energy, be efficient and so on. But actually spending time with people to understand how do they understand and make decisions about energy in their everyday lives was a big part of the work. So, we looked at things like people who've got feedback devices of different kinds about how much energy they're using or how much it's costing. How do they understand that feedback? How do they make decisions about it? Is it just another thing that you have to pay attention to, or is it something that you can build into your life? So we looked at the ways people use these kind of devices or fit them into their days. We also looked at different ways of getting people to kind of produce timelines and sort of so we could reference what they did or what they said they did and why with the actual amount of energy, electricity, gas, and so on that were being used by the home. And so one of the things that came from this is that actually people's mental models and mental imagery play a big role in certain types of behavior. So, I'd come at design for behavior change, saying, let's change what people do, let's give them information and so on. But actually it became very clear that people's understanding of these concepts was actually really important in what they did. And just telling people the number of kilowatt hours that they were using or how much it cost doesn't necessarily relate very well to people's mental models of these things. So we found that the invisibility of something like energy is a key issue in people's understanding. And it also became sort of evident that like lots of these things that are kind of invisible concepts in the world, everything from government to to politics, to energy, to things like climate change, even human emotions, things that are invisible or abstract, they're less easy to draw, I guess, or they're less easy to visualize, but that means that people have very different interpretations of them. And we thought, well, maybe from a design point of view, we can do something about that. We can help people kind of explore these invisible concepts in different ways. So with energy, we did this, my colleague Flora Bowden and I did this work at the V&A in London, the Victoria and Albert Museum, where we got members of the public to draw what they imagined energy to look like. And so, we had in total about 180 people at different events drawing what they imagined this kind of abstract concept to be. And we started to see from this that the metaphors people use were important to people's mental models of these kind of abstract or invisible concepts. Because if if something doesn't have an actual form, how do you draw it? You have to translate it somehow into something else. And so some of the things, these are quite interesting. And then obviously none of these is right or wrong. This is how people visualize what they think energy is. What does it look like? And some of them have kind of, metaphors of flow or kind of chaos embedded in them. Some of them are, more like kind of fire and things. Some of them, there's a lot of sort of vortices and sort of swirling whirlpools and things and different types of spirals and so on, or lightning and stuff like that. And there's a lot that use the sun as a metaphor. Some of them more about kind of personal energy and like energy is like the heart of something. And so there's a book, if you're interested, there's a book that Flora and I and Rama and Claire Brass wrote that's a free download that explores some of the issues behind these things. But I think one of the things that came across from this was that this idea that if you can get some of these metaphors and these other imaginaries out of people's heads and into a shared space, then you can discuss them better, right? So these things are wrapped up in people's minds, they're often not expressed, but the act of trying to like give people a voice to them or kind of even prompt people to try to externalize them has quite a lot of value. So this is my first recommendation, right? There's 4 kind of tips or recommendations or whatever in this talk. This is the first one. We'll come back to them at the end, so don't worry. But it's this idea of like getting them out of people's heads so you can talk about them and discuss them. And because none of them is right or wrong, but if we don't know what we're talking about, we don't know how we're imagining it. Well, we know how we imagine it, but we maybe don't know how other people do. So you might think, well, how does it relate to interaction design? This seems quite an abstract thing. One of the ways one of the directions we took it was this idea of more qualitative user interfaces, because none of those things that people drew, for example, have any numbers on them. And there were very few. In the 180 we got, there were only a very few of them that showed actual quantities. It was more about the kind of structure of things, or the shape of things, or the effects of it. So we thought about, well, can we design more qualitative types of user interface? And so some of this was around using sound. And these are prototypes that are not very well resolved, but they're kind of explorations of what happens, for example, here, if you could hear the amount of electricity that was being used. And this one, I'll just give you a preview. This doesn't sound great because of the way it's recorded, but this first one used bird song of different kinds that related to how much electricity was being used. Sorry, it doesn't sound good at all. So it certainly put you off using. It wasn't intended to put people off using more electricity, but it certainly sounds like that. But we've taken that work further in different ways. Like this, more recently, been doing this, combining it with vibration as well, so that it's not just different sound, but you can actually see patterns that relate to how much electricity is being used. So this project, Electric Acoustic, use cymatic displays, which is basically just a vibration display. And so this, we changed the sound. I don't know how good this will sound now, but it's a more ambient than a screeching bird. But this is a project that we did earlier this year and is being developed further at the moment. But it effectively produces patterns that are a qualitative kind of visualization of electricity. Now, this isn't great. This is a prototype. It's not there yet, but there's something there, I think, that we haven't seen before. And so, you get different patterns with different kind of cycles or different characteristics of electricity being used. Some other work around these more kind of qualitative visualizations. This is Dixon Lowe, who's one of my students, who was intrigued by what some of the metaphors that I'm trying to think how to word this. So in augmented reality, designers could do lots of things that you can't do in the real world. Right, so in augmented reality, you could look at that USB stick, the pen drive, and it seemed to be floating. Just by adding a shadow to it, you could make it look like it's floating or sinking into the table, or it could suddenly go grayscale, for example. And that's not that difficult to do in augmented reality, but what does it mean? Like, what would it mean if it looks like your USB stick is floating? What does that tell you? So Dixon was interested in exploring those questions. Not that there's a right answer, but it's like designers are going to have this ability, but what do these kind of different qualities actually mean to people? So it's a kind of metaphorical exploration of this kind of work. So it's worth looking at. If you're interested in that, he wrote a kind of set of guidelines for how designers could use this stuff. We've also done some things looking more at sort of physicalizing data in different ways. Like, how can you turn what would otherwise be a table or a graph into physical forms? And some of it's kind of data sculptures, but how can we preserve the qualitative dimension in that kind of work? So I suppose my second recommendation, if you like, with working around metaphors would be to explore more qualitative forms of visualization, because metaphors as concepts are not, well, the quantitative aspect of them is underplayed, I think. So the qualities of things are often what makes a metaphor work, because we see a quality in one thing that we then sort of transpose to somewhere else. And so, but actually designing that more into new forms of visualization, I think would be an interesting way of doing things. So this was a project, Mental Landscapes, that I mentioned earlier, that Delaney Ricketts, who's a researcher at Carnegie Mellon, started to develop, which is enabling people to use different landscape metaphors to talk about their own lives or to map out their own kind of careers or their own hopes for the future and all this sort of stuff. And she was interested by the fact that people often use landscape metaphors to talk about their lives. You talk about moving into a new field, or I'll have a better view of the future once I get to a particular position, or this was a steep kind of curve to get to where I am now, or I'm not on the right track, or I'm going to choose a different path. And all of these things, which in some languages they're more common than others, but they're very common in English certainly, that people will talk about metaphors related to direction in a sort of fictional landscape when they're talking about their own lives. So Lainey thought, well, can we actually enable people to build these things? Like, can we give them landscape elements, these kind of laser-cut pieces, and get them to construct model landscapes that represent their own lives in different ways? So this is a group of master's students, for example, mapping out together their own, where they've come from in different places, and they're on that raft in the middle. They're on like a boat floating down a river, and they're about to hit somewhere where there's like, rocky patch, there's kind of, decisions to be made and paths, different directions to go in. So this is really, a kind of group exploration of their own thinking about their own futures. But there's these kind of, this is the sort of metaphors that are in it. It's basically saying projects are landscapes or careers are landscapes. So we did it also with people's projects that they worked on together. And again, this is not right, but it's a way of thinking, right? And it's, it's something that could be explored in different ways. Some of the work we've done around mental health as well has been about enabling people to express quite abstract concepts that maybe they don't have the right word for. Maybe there isn't a word for how you think about a particular way you feel. And so this project you can see here that actually got people to build new words from joining together other words that existed already. So it's kind of difficult to read, but they were things that combined three different things that people felt. So maybe they felt anxious, but also excited, but also tired. Maybe that's like, anxiety tired or something as a word. So they would join them together. And it was inspired basically by languages more like German, for example, where you would concatenate lots of words together to make longer words. Could you use that as a way of expressing otherwise unexpressible emotions? And also draw it and illustrate it with these kind of model making. This next project took the physical aspects more directly and gave people these elements to construct kind of abstract models of particular emotions they were feeling. So this is someone who dreads, who fears the kind of the things that are around them. So the person saw herself as that white circle in the middle, the white sphere, surrounded by these kind of dark things that were, she had to get past them to get to the white cubes around the outside, which is what she wanted to get to. Now, this is not particularly profound, but it's interesting. It's using design tools in a way to help people talk about themselves, about their thinking, about their emotions in a way that maybe they wouldn't be able to otherwise. There are other ways of doing it, like this project, Empathy, the Empathy Rock Garden, tried to look at almost revealing to people that other people think about things in a particular way. So you might think, I'm the only person who's worried about that. But if you can see that someone else has thought that, then you can kind of vote on it, or you can add your own comment to it. So, for example, this is someone, and this is done with a group of international students. This is someone saying, I miss my friends on the other side of the world. And once that thought, that kind of abstract thought is out there as an object, other people can add their own rocks to it to say, I agree. Or you can annotate it with another rock that says, yes, and, something else. So again, this is like this idea of like physicalizing abstract thoughts is obvious, but it's something that I think there's a lot of potential in design research and in interaction design. This was another project that looked at, in the same kind of set of projects that looked at, could people create a potion, like a kind of mixture of things they needed for the week ahead? In the next week, I'm going to need a certain amount of kind of, like stamina or hope or confidence. In the next week, I'm going to need this amount of it. So you could kind of prepare your own like visualization of what you felt you needed in the week ahead. And again, there's no right or wrong answer, but in some ways, the process of doing it is itself useful to people. So these are really ways of using metaphors, whether that's a potion or whether it's, rocks, like seeing ideas as rocks, which seems a bit strange, but it kind of works, to externalize people's mental models or these other kind of invisible or intangible things as part of a participatory design kind of process. And so what this leads to is the third kind of recommendation or point, which is, could we actually design new metaphors? Could we see as designers that it's within our power to create new metaphors to help people understand things in new ways? And those people might be users, they might be customers, they might be our own team, it might be within an organization. Can we develop a different metaphor for what we're doing that helps us see it in a different way or understand it in a different way? And metaphors in design are, I've got a long history, and almost everything in digital interaction design is a metaphor. If you think about the early, like the icons there, designed by Susan Kerr, like the disc and the trash can, but even the idea of files themselves as a metaphor, and desktops, and almost everything on the screen there is a metaphor. In fact, even arrows. I mean, arrows are a metaphor for on screen for a metaphor for a sort of physical arrow in the real world, but an arrow itself is a pointing device as opposed to something you would shoot at someone is itself a kind of metaphor. And there have been attempts to bring different metaphors into interaction design in the past that haven't always been so successful. But I don't know how many of you ever used Microsoft Bob, but this was an attempt in the 1990s to create a sort of home environment as an operating system. So, you would place files in different places, you would use different applications around the house. And actually now this wouldn't be that difficult to do. I can imagine a kind of VR or augmented reality version of this that actually might be quite interesting. I'm sure people are doing that. But I mean, everything in interaction design really has a metaphorical element. I mean, this was a group of students who deconstructed in Excel how many metaphors were present. And we don't have to talk about them, but almost everything is in some way a metaphor. And if you've done any work on this kind of area, you'll probably have read this book, Metaphors We Live By, which is from 1980 by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. And this is a book in kind of linguistics. It's not a design book, but it has a lot of useful insights for this field. Their basic argument was that metaphors are foundational to language, right? They're and our conceptual system, but they're so ingrained that we often we're not even conscious of them. And if you're kind of thinking, if you're one step ahead of me now, you're thinking, well, actually, foundation, that's a metaphor, and ingrained is a metaphor. One step ahead is a metaphor. Right? Everything is a metaphor, but we don't even notice it until we have to reflect on it. Reflecting is a metaphor as well. And so, and the Lakoff and Johnson said things like, looking at phrases like these kind of relatively common phrases in English this is about people arguing or debating, that there are so many metaphors inherent in the way people speak about things that in this case they're all about war, right? They're basically saying argument is war. It's about defeating people or beating them. And Lakoff and Johnson said, well, what if argument is dance? What would it do to language? Not just what would it do to language, what would it do to society and politics if we talked about, instead of people trying to defeat each other in arguments, about trying to dance with each other, trying to, work together to doing different things perhaps, but actually working together to produce something better. And so I hope you can see this is good for design, right? This is a good starting point for coming up with ideas and things like that. So one question would be, what metaphors do we have that shape our worldview that have sort of persuaded us without us necessarily realizing it? What things are there? What assumptions do we have? What imaginaries do we have that we don't even realize where they came from, perhaps, but they shape what we do and how we think? Government what sort of metaphors are there for government? I mean, is it a parent? Some countries it is. Is it a strict father? It's a slight subset of parent, but in some countries that's the way that a common imaginary. Is government like the people itself, which again is another approach? Is government the servant of the people? All these things. Does it have to be in that kind of power structure? Does government have to be related to people in that way? Lots of ideas about what economies could be. Should the economy be a kind of, is it all about growth? What is the metaphor of growth? Is it about something growing out of control? I mean, plants grow, but so does cancer, right? What sort of growth is it that the economy should be if it's about growing? And actually last week or the week before, some of us in the Imaginaries Lab did this. It's online as a kind of webinar with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation about trying to apply new metaphors to the economy to try to think about economies in different ways. So if you're interested in that kind of direction, a more sort of sustainable economy stuff, we've got a webinar about that. But I mean, I think it's worth being aware of the cultural dimensions of metaphors and how they differ in different places and how they're used. And in general, it's worth being aware of the limitations of them. We're not saying these are necessarily right. They're just, they have side effects as well. The two famous books by Susan Sontag looking at this about how metaphors used around disease, in illness in general and specifically AIDS, actually have had such effect on kind of public consciousness and what gets funded, frankly. What do government see as priorities and so on. If disease is something people fight, then if they don't fight it hard enough, Is it their fault? Do you effectively blame people for not fighting disease hard enough? Or, is disease something polluting, which is often the kind of some of the metaphors that are used. So basically, are people who are ill, are they to be ostracized? Are they unclean? Is disease a punishment? And all these things, there are cultural dimensions to it, but they're important because they play into the way that some of these things are thought about in society. So to come back to this point, all metaphors are wrong, but some are useful sometimes, right? It's quite vague as a thing, but I think it's a reasonable heuristic to use. So you could use metaphors as a way of prompting discussion or reflection. The fact that often we would present things that were different and people would say, well, that's not right. Like the ways in which people find them wrong tell you something about how they think. So if I said to you, okay, a really good metaphor for like this conference is a banana, right? I don't know, but I mean, you might say, well, that's not a good metaphor for the conference. Well, why isn't it a good metaphor for the conference? Oh, well, bananas, I don't know, well, maybe we think about why it is a good metaphor, actually. I'm trying to think. It's on for a certain period, so it's ripe for a certain time. It's good, it tastes nice. I don't know, you have to unpeel it. I don't know how that works through the conference. But I'm just trying to think through these different things. But I mean, the way that people discuss it, even if it's just a discussion prompt, I think there's some value there. So what new metaphors, what it comes down to, really, or at least the thing that we've been doing so far, is it's inspired by an idea that Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, mentions in passing a few times in some of her writing, which is about how we could, society needs new metaphors for particular concepts. And so really what we started to do was almost not completely randomly. I mean, it's not actually a random process, but we would take lists of things and try to see, well, could one of these be a metaphor for the other? Like, could a zoo be a metaphor for your career? Well, maybe, I don't know, it could be that you feel that you're judged by people who, you're in a cage and you're being assessed by people who are watching you, or it could be that you've assembled lots of different skills together, or that your career is about, bringing together lots of different things in one place or something, right? And there's no right answer, but it's almost the process of going through and thinking about it could lead to different ways of considering things, or, these all cross over in lots of different ways. So this is a form of sort of idea generation through juxtaposition. Arthur Koestler in the 1960s argued that this is like the basis of most creativity, but also humor as well, which is interesting. Like the reason lots of these are funny is perhaps because of the same unexpectedness that makes them creative. So, for design, the question might be, well, could we design new types of interfaces or different types of projects or new stories even that use new metaphors to help people understand things in new ways? And so we did a series of these kind of events, and one of the first ones actually was in Chile at the Universidad de Desarrollo in Santiago, and in Concepcion as well, that was around trying to design new types of interface using different metaphors. And this format, we developed it through lots of workshops with different people. This was at a Google SPAN conference, which is like one of the Google's design conferences. This was at the IXDA Interaction Conference earlier this year in Lyon. And we've done others like at UX Lisbon and so on. And the idea of these workshops really is that the participants get to try to combine different things that could be metaphors in new ways to generate concepts for new types of interface or new types of service or new types of product. And they can come with their own ideas. Like it could be like, you've got a particular problem that you really want to address. You need to find a good metaphor for it. Or it could just be that you use it as a way of generating ideas. But all of these cards, you can download them at newmetaphors.com. I mean, it's the site at present is a bit, it's going to evolve, it's going to get better. But they are there to download with the sort of instructions for how you can do this kind of workshop yourself. But the sort of things, these are ones that have come out at workshops that I think were quite interesting. I'm just going to show you a couple of them. But like this was a group who were working on pensions. How would you visualize pensions? How could you design an interface for people to manage their pensions that was different to the current ones? And, plant growth might actually be a really interesting one. You have to prepare things. Things take a while to flower or to bear fruit. You can harvest them at particular times. Sometimes some of the plants shade each other out or, tangle each other up. But, you have to maintain it. If you just leave it, some things will grow and others won't. And the things that grow might not be the things you want to. So, that could actually be an interesting metaphor for an interface around pension management. This was an interesting one about using shadows as a metaphor for worrying about what people think of you. And I'm not sure what the interface would be for this. I'm not sure what product this is or service, but the idea that, like a shadow is something that it can be quite fleeting, but it can affect you, in the moment, and it comes from someone else. So there's something there about that. Even things like this, like leaves changing color as a metaphor for driver alertness. You think, well, that's strange. But I mean, having something where, your attention fades in the same way as a leaf does, and visualizing that for people so you can see, oh, okay, you're not paying attention. This leaf is changing color or it's dropping off, is an interesting kind of metaphor for that. So anyway, there's various versions of this. There's a Twitter bot that just selects some, so you get a different one every minute, which is probably too regularly. I think that's a bit too. No one cares about it enough to get a new one every minute. But there's a Twitter bot. There's also Devika Singh, one of our researchers, has been developing an SMS bot that you could tell it more about what you wanted. I'm working on a particular topic, and it would suggest things that could be metaphors that could be interesting or relevant to it. So we're aiming to go in a direction with this, that site, newmetaphors.com, becomes a kind of partly crowdsourced, partly machine learning driven. We have to say that because it will get funding if it's machine learning driven. No, I mean, it would actually be really useful, but a sort of platform that enables people to explore different metaphors in different ways and apply them to things. So basically, new metaphors could be new ways to understand. And so, this third point, I'll just repeat it, could you design new metaphors to help people understand in things in new ways? And so fourthly, just as a final thing, and this is a very quick point, but just like if you can build up your own repertoire, like your own collection of interesting alternative metaphors, it's actually quite an intriguing kind of thing to do, to look around you and think, well, actually, could I design something that used that instead of something else? Could this be an interesting metaphor for something I'm working on? It's almost like look around you and see things and actually deliberately do that annoying party trick kind of thing, a party game of like seeing everything as a metaphor for everything else. You can actually generate quite a lot of ideas. So collect your own, basically, I guess is what I'm saying. And so this is a form of, if you know the term apophenia, which is often seen as a very negative thing. It's people reading patterns into things that are not really there. So it might be that you see a face in the clouds, or you see, you see I don't know, those sort of patterns. But could you do it deliberately, almost as a way of generating ideas, to force yourself to see one thing as an interface for another, maybe, or as a display for something else? Like this, I mean, this is a nice one that I came across that I quite like, right? So there are ways that you can use this in quite creative ways. So just final then, to run through these, the four things, actually I'll put them on screen all at once, that's probably better. So get metaphors and other imaginaries out of people's heads and into a shared space. Explore using more qualitative forms of visualization wherever you can. Try and design new metaphors to help people understand things in new ways. And try and build up your own repertoire of interesting alternatives or kind of directions that you can take things in that are different. So yeah, I will finish there, but thank you.
Aqui, do outro lado, atrás de você.
Oh, hi.
Tudo bem? É uma pergunta mais breve. Sobre metáforas, qual é a sua percepção de pegar essas metáforas que já existem e evoluir elas? É um risco, mas quando isso se faz necessário e como fazer do melhor jeito?
Okay, so is it a risk to evolve existing metaphors, and what's the best way to evolve them? I mean, I think all of these things have risks. I mean, the risk would be that you introduce some new misunderstanding or something into the world that actually has bad consequences in time. And I think as long as any of these things can be seen that they are only different ways of thinking, they're not the thing itself, they're just a new tool that enables us to think differently. I'd like to see that as being a way that helps protect us in some way against them being done in ways that are bad. I mean, that one of the things would be to try to think through the side effects. Like even just spend a moment thinking through, well, what could some of the consequences be? What are some of the things that could lead from that? and try and map them out in some kind of flow chart. I think that could be a good way to start to think through the risks of changing them. If that makes sense. Is that okay? Okay.
Oi? Aqui.
Hi.
Oi. Eu fiquei interessada naquele exercício que era sobre as pedras, porque me lembrou uma obra da Yoko Ono, em que as pessoas escrevem em pedras e é relacionado à cultura japonesa. E eu fiquei pensando sobre a nossa cultura latino-americana, que a gente tem muitos frameworks e tipos de exercícios que são sempre muito ligados ao que está acontecendo no Vale do Silício, coisas assim. E acho que aqui a gente tem uma cultura muito rica e anterior que poderia ser um jeito muito legal de se conectar e com uma linguagem mais direta com os públicos que a gente está trabalhando, né? E eu queria saber o que você acha a respeito disso, dessas questões, mas se seria interessante a gente buscar mais referências fora do design mesmo, renomado, para se comunicar com as pessoas.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's part of the thing that inspired trying to do the more qualitative types of interface, was that they could draw on things that have meaning to people in their own lives, in different cultures, or draw on historical traditions maybe, or things that are not necessarily what someone in Silicon Valley would use as a way of interpreting it. I mean, we were definitely inspired by. So you mentioned like Yoko Ono, and we've been inspired by a lot of the kind of Fluxus movement and that sort of work of almost like introducing provocations into the world that are about getting you to think of something in a different way. So I mean, some of that work around almost like reinterpreting one thing as another, and saying, well, maybe this thing is, maybe the secret to, what you should do tomorrow is contained in the glass of water in front of you, or maybe you pick a random photo of somewhere and you say, okay, this photo actually contains the instructions for I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example that might be something she would have used, that contains the instructions for, the person you will marry, or something like that, right? You can use those kind of provocations, but it would be nice to use the more cultural aspects and to build on some of the different forms of meaning in different cultures and the ways that those things are constructed. I mean, I think it just takes designers doing it. And I guess it's difficult if you're in a situation where the sort of dominant metaphors are very much driven by quite individualistic Silicon Valley culture, where everything is about having a feed that's tailored exactly to your needs right now, or maybe not actually your needs, but those of an advertiser. But how do you challenge that? And it may be that actually a lot of more methods from different cultures, or representations, or ways of thinking from different cultures could actually be, they could have a huge effect in design, if only we can work out how to use them, how to bring them in. So I would say it just maybe be bold about doing it and try and make those connections rather than just defaulting to kind of standard North American sort of tropes. Does that make sense?
Hey, Dan. Here.
Oh.
Here. To the other side.
Oh, sorry.
How are you doing?
Hi.
Eu vou fazer minha pergunta em português. Bom, Dan, você falou que as metáforas têm um aspecto positivo para ajudar as pessoas a entenderem alguma coisa que elas ainda não entendem. Mas existe, obviamente, um lado negro das metáforas que são utilizadas também, eventualmente, para as pessoas deixarem de entender alguma coisa. E, por exemplo, uma metáfora que está sendo bastante utilizada para as pessoas não entenderem o que está acontecendo no mundo delas é, por exemplo, a Terra plana, e outras metáforas que existem, por exemplo, também na informática, como, por exemplo, a pessoa olha no Facebook, no Twitter, e vê lá milhões de pessoas seguindo elas, e é uma metáfora para uma coisa que não está acontecendo, ela não é famosa como ela parece ser, né? Então, nós, como designers de interação, temos uma responsabilidade a respeito também das metáforas que fazem as pessoas não entenderem, né? Eu gostaria de ouvir seus comentários, que eu sei que você também desenvolve uma linha crítica a esse assunto.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, first of all, like all of the metaphors are wrong, right? They all have consequences as well. And I mean, it depends on what sort of misunderstandings they are, I suppose. Like if they're things that are actually actively harming people or they're harming society, then I think it's probably our responsibility, if we've got the ability to influence them or to change that, then it's our responsibility as designers to try to address that. I think there are probably some fictions or some half-truths that are probably useful for people to understand things that are more complicated than they're able to understand in everyday life. But it seems to be that designers have this are often about bridging these different understandings. We want to make things simple for people to use, but not so simple that they use them wrongly, or what's the right level of simplicity to preserve and what in things. And so I could go I could bring in kind of cybernetics here and talk about like requisite variety, and we need to have people need to have the requisite variety to deal with the situations that they encounter. But then working out what that variety should be is itself a problem that's probably got no solution. So, I mean, I don't know what the answer is. I think you make a good point. I think it's just the sort of thing that designers just have to try and recognize and not hide. To be able to maybe show people that there are many different ways you could understand something. Even that, like even introducing the idea to people that there are alternative ways of understanding this thing that you understand, like that itself is a big step, I think. Because it's even just showing people there are alternative ways of thinking can be a step to a different sort of understanding, I would say. I don't know whether that helps, but sometimes thanks. I'd probably better finish there, I think. It's the time, but thank you, everyone. Thanks.